Well, welcome to the Foundation for a Path Forward, Islam Unraveled Anti-Racism podcast. We really appreciate Professor Ghayda Hassan, and you're from the University of Montreal at Quebec.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Exactly. And then also in the Department of Psychology as a clinical psychologist and a professor of clinical psychology. And now going into really the purpose of this discussion is your work on with the Canada Practitioners Network for the Prevention of Radicalization and Extremist Violence. So quite a lot there, because there's clinical psychology and radical extremism, and we all know that mental health issues do kind of influence radicalization and extremism. So maybe to start off, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and how you got into this work, and then how you from clinical psychology transitioned to specializing in extremism and radicalization.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tarek. So my interest in studying, my interest in work came really with the work on violence. So, as a war survivor myself, and then having the opportunity to study in a domain that I love, which is clinical psychology, my main focus was always supporting and preventing in violence context. And I was both working in family-related violence, gender-based violence, but also organized violence. So, refugees, immigrants, or individuals who have experienced conflict and violence. And so extremism was always there, because a lot of the conflicts that people have experienced is connected in some way to different forms of extremism. So even before we started calling these forms violent radicalization or violent extremism, and then gradually, I guess starting with 9/11 and the war on terror, and we know some of the negative consequences of the war on terror on marginalized communities, my interest became even more, stronger and more developed. And then things just, went on into now what we call more violent radicalization or violent extremism. And this is how, I got to be interested in doing that work. And most importantly, I think the desire was really to help practitioners and people working on ground, facing the daily challenges in providing services while really addressing and reducing stigmatization.
And with our modern age and unprecedented times with social media and the proliferation of conspiracy theories and misinformation, false information, disinformation. So we're at a stage in society where polarization, racism, prejudices are becoming at all-time highs. And so the role of social media in mental health issues, and then leading into misinformation rabbit holes that result into full-blown conspiracy theories that result in people doing violent attacks in real life.
So speaking with that about that, I really want to mention that mental health should be understood the way I work it and I see it is, it should be understood in the largest sense. So mental health does not mean people who have a psychiatric diagnosis, right? Mental health really means just the well-being. And so it may refer to people who have more severe mental health problems, but it also refers to anybody who's experienced actually a life crisis, who's making that person vulnerable and experiencing maybe some anxiety or some anger, or just feeling lost, or having an identity crisis, or experiencing depressive feelings. So it's really, because I want to address that, because sometimes people misunderstand a little bit what we mean by mental health. And this is why it is relevant for this field, because when social crises happen, such as the COVID, that is even more than a social crisis, it's like an economic, political, and public health and social crisis. It may make people more vulnerable, some individuals. And when these individuals become more vulnerable, and you have added factors of social isolation, of confinement, of higher access or higher consumption of internet, and sometimes consuming the wrong information, or let's say, the more problematic information on the internet, people's vulnerability and kind of emotional and cognitive openness to messages that actually can become problematic for themselves and for others become bigger, and people become more isolated, so less able to receive help and support, either from significant others or just from regular, social services or psychological services. And so all these kind of connect together to make people more vulnerable to misinformation, to disinformation, to hate, to conspiracy theories, because they're actually looking for answers. And they will take the answer that calms the anxieties or the crisis that they are going through.
And even one of the most horrific acts that happened to the Muslim community in 2017, January 29th, where the Quebec shooter was going down various rabbit holes online. And this was during the time that Donald Trump talked about the Muslim ban, implemented the Muslim ban on Muslim majority countries. And this person, the shooter, had a social media picture of him with the Make America Great Again cap. And so all of these things to read and somehow consume information that dehumanize Muslims and prompt people to do what he did, which was to go into a mosque where people are praying and shoot them in the back. And it goes to show that, otherwise a normal person, but then through isolation, through just going down these rabbit holes. And one of the things we've been researching recently is the algorithms, and there's a book called The Algorithms of Oppression, which talk about the Google algorithm, the Facebook algorithm that emphasizes, or the way it works is the most engaged content gets ranked the highest, and so, or the most relevant. And so but that doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate information. And so we know online hate proliferates exponentially more than real news or real facts. And so if what the algorithms are serving up are that radicalized content that is further increasing somebody's prejudice and bias, the algorithms themselves are reinforcing these biases and prejudices to eventually get a person to that critical edge where they start to think about violent attacks against other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, it's a pretty complex thing because there are no one trajectories, right? So when we try to do research on understanding trajectories that lead to violent radicalization or extremism, we quickly see that, we cannot come out with 3 or 4 trajectories, right? So there are no clear set trajectories. People have different vulnerabilities, and these risk factors added to their vulnerabilities kind of interplay together to increase risk. But the internet plays a significant role in that it catalyzes. It's like it puts oil on fire, basically, in more simple terms, for risk, and it kind of produces what we have always said and what you're referring to in terms of algorithm, to those kinds of echo chambers. So people just receiving an echo back and back what they think, and then kind of further confirming them in what they think, and making them think that because they are consistently receiving this information, that actually this information is shared by a lot of people, which is not necessarily true. And it must be true because, it's coming back, and sometimes from trusted people or trusted sources. So there is like a significant trap, in the media content. And we have seen through analyses that in most cases where attacks have happened, internet at some point was a factor, either because people searched for information, searched for ideas for planning, or were simply, exposed to content or to other individuals who basically encouraged them to do that. Add to that, personal distress, mental health distress. The example of the Quebec mass shooter had also some mental health issues, social isolation, and then you just go into this kind of disconnected, you kind of disconnect from the reality in the sense that you go into your own scheme and you think that that's the only way finally to act. And of course, there are triggers. And for some people, internet and social media may play that trigger role. For others, there may be other factors that trigger them into violent action.
And the initial aspect of information itself is one thing. And then there's the social aspect of people that share these beliefs and ideas and to connect and communicate with them. And from a mental health perspective, people have a desire for longing, a desire for significance, a desire for some sort of friendship or brotherhood or belonging. And so the misinformation is there. And then there are people that share these beliefs, and some share it in more extremes than maybe the people that are initially getting into this. And so what's unprecedented in this time is that people can connect to literally dozens, hundreds, thousands, millions of people around the world that share these ideologies. And that, again, feeds into not only misinformation, but this groupthink and mob mentality online that further encourages them. Case in point, there's the Tree of Life synagogue shooter, and he said, something about a conspiracy that synagogue was somehow, taking care of Central American immigrants and refugees, and he felt it was his duty to put a stop to it. And then obviously the anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish sentiment that he had, and he killed 11 people. But he posted it online, and same with a lot of these. The Christchurch shooter, they post what they're going to be doing online. This is what they're planning. This is what they're going to do. So it's like they want that significance. They want to be known. They want people to know they did this. So let's maybe talk about how the misinformation and now this groupthink and how that's also influencing society. Case in point, the January 6th Capitol insurrection, and how all these pieces are coming together.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you're saying, because there's this this kind of quest for significance and belonging. We have seen it a lot during the COVID crisis, where people were isolated, were confined, and then suddenly they found those spaces, those group, chat groups or whatever, they found those belonging spaces where they suddenly started, sharing their time and their ideas and their emotions, and felt like-minded, living people. So absolutely, to your point, what the internet is providing is those, I call them illusions, because they are not real belonging, right? They are not real, strong, longer term bonds like you would find in real life. They are experienced as real, of course, when the person is, but they are providing that feeling that the person is belonging to a group. And then what happens is that this kind of produces this feeling of group solidarity. Sometimes we even talk about identity fusion, meaning that the person kind of loses gradually their own, their own individualized identity, what kind of differentiates them from others. And this identity fuses with the group discourse. So basically the person, it's as if the person becomes, talks on behalf of the group, repeats the same discourses, ideas, and they have very little capacity to kind of differentiate themselves from what the group leader, for example, is saying. And so there's this aspect that kind of reinforces the beliefs and the kind of the attachment to the beliefs, because we are attached to a group. A lot of studies around violent radicalization and extremism have shown that what actually attracts people into group is not so much the ideology at first. It's really that the fact that they can belong. They finally feel that they are part of a group, that they have like this kind of family, you know what I mean? Now, what you are referring to in terms of people telling what they're going to do on the internet, is that sometimes what happens is that in addition to that belonging, there's this kind of wanting to portray oneself as a hero, somebody who's going to do something right and who's going to do something heroic, and they're going to get the admiration, they're going to get this portrayal of themselves as heroic. They're going to get on one side the admiration, and on the other side they're going to impact communities in even more traumatic ways than just what they did. And so, because we know that when an attack happens and the pictures of that attack are relayed on internet, we do know that it had a lot of traumatic impact on any person who would identify with the community or with the individuals who are being attacked. And so the impact of an attack is not just on the immediate victims, it's also on the community, on every individual that identifies. And then what happens is that those extremist groups reify those people as heroes, those attackers, as heroes and models of inspiration that they should look up to. And we see that in conversation within extremist groups, in the chats and in the conversation, people referring to the acts that these different individuals have committed as models, as heroes that should be followed. And so in prevention, we consistently repeat the message that we should avoid any portrayal of attackers as heroes or as victims or as monsters, because in both cases, they become attractive to people who are vulnerable to these kinds of ideas and acts. We should portray them as real humans who have a lot of problems and who have done very hurtful things that need to be, repaired, and where we also need to repair for the communities, and that need to be held accountable for what they have done. We need to do those prevention efforts, because this can indeed be a strong slippery slope.
Absolutely. And there's a movement, no notoriety, by not naming the shooters, because by keep repeating their names, they become mythologized, they become martyrs to their sympathizers. And so, case in point, the shooter in Christchurch, he had the name of the Quebec shooter written on his weapon while he was doing what he did. So he had inspiration from Quebec. And then on top of that is this whole subculture of terminology and even music, and case in point, the term "remove kebab" is the number one anti-Muslim search term. Most general public doesn't know what that means. What is remove kebab? It sounds kind of crazy, but then doing the research, that this was the anthem the Serbian militias would play when they were exterminating Bosnian Muslims during the Serbian-Bosnian War in the 90s. So remove kebab is a term that they'll use where innocuously nobody will necessarily know what it means unless people that are part of that subculture. Mm-hmm. And then there's an anthem, and the Christchurch shooter was playing this anthem on his way to his attack. So they have a subculture of terminology, of music, so many elements. And then I wanted to talk about the white replacement theory or conspiracy theory or white genocide, and how it's leading into this victimization mentality by certain elements of the white supremacist groups out there. And let's talk about their ideologies and what's influencing their efforts to present.
Yeah. So in terms of these, I mean, it's whether being related, just before we tackle the white supremacy as such, what you are referring to is so interesting, because once a person has their foot in the door, let's say, often what we discover is that to kind of attract a person into this extremist group, it's often through your day-to-day socialization activities. So music, going to this person's get-together, or to a party, or to a bar, whatever. And through music, or did you listen to that song? So there's a lot of introduction through day-to-day ways, and we call them those day-to-day socialization into the extremist movements. You wouldn't start immediately with highly violent ideologies. Most people would retract. But if you gradually introduce, through music or through, those subtle messages, socialization, belonging, being, feeling accepted, feeling part in the group, and gradually you kind of feed that, you socialize the person into the ideology. And the function that these songs have to actually kind of, and they have been used in the armies, they have been used across history, these kinds of war anthems, to kind of mobilize the emotions and even further like cut oneself from the empathy basically before committing an act. So this has a specific function. In terms of white supremacy groups, I think we're seeing that extreme violent right and white supremacy, violent white supremacist groups, these have been coming up and down through history, right? So it's not nothing necessarily new. But now we are seeing a resurgence of these groups. There are a lot of groups in Canada. Now, fortunately, right now in Canada, although there are many groups, a lot of them are small in terms of membership. And this is still reassuring. So in terms of people who are actually, call themselves as active members of these groups. Where it comes from, it's a set of very complex social, economic, and of course, political conditions. And often we see when you have social and economic crises, whether these crises are true or whether they are perceived, it becomes a very ripe environment for this polarization because we need to find the guilty, right? We need to find those scapegoats. It's a psychological process. When something happens to you that you feel is out of control, and you feel that you are losing more and more control on your daily activities, and also feeling that you are experiencing more and more grievances, then you tend to try to find who's responsible for that. And this is where collective discourses become built in trying to find the scapegoated person, the person or the group who's responsible for that. And they will often be these groups, the minority groups, the marginalized groups that will be constructed gradually, publicly and socially as enemies or as threats. Add to that specific political discourses that are connected to, economic and geo-economic conflicts and priorities that certain countries have, it becomes practical to construct certain communities as enemies. We can think about the Russian during the Cold War, as we say. We can think about the Muslims for the past several years, that we cannot ignore, that we have to understand that it's also connected to very specific political and economic let's say, interests and issues that are happening between Arab and more Muslim world countries and the Western countries. But what's happening locally is that as the population, and if you look at the bigger number of white supremacy movements being really in the central states of the US, for example, if we look at the US, a lot of them are a white, let's say, the citizen who is actually today, despite considering themselves as the real citizens of the country, struggling with economic difficulties, with access to job, with education, perceiving themselves as experiencing grievances, as being more and more controlled by their governments and deprived of their freedom by their governments. And so they are trying to find the guilty for that. And this is how also the political opinion will mobilize this anger toward a specific enemy. If we look at Trump, for example, and Trump discourses, it was clearly discourses putting oil and fire and directing the frustration of these groups toward specific constructed enemies, which are mostly immigrants, Muslim communities more specifically, but also immigrants and anybody basically who is identified as not non-white or not part of that group. Whereas when you think about it, often when we do prevention, we try to tell them, you are experiencing the same difficulties that immigrants or those other individuals you're marginalizing are experiencing. You're basically experiencing the same grievances, that the current system is responsible for these grievances, not one or the other group. So Tarek, I don't know if I'm making myself clear here. I have the impression that I lost some clarity. But what I'm trying to say is that those movements build on the grievances that they are feeling and attribute those grievances to specific groups identified as others. By whom? By themselves, but also by dominant political and social discourses. And so it's important to be conscious of that. It's not just an individual issue. There are political and social issues there. And prevention has to take all these levels into consideration.
And now using social media as a weapon and the weaponization of social media by even state actors in terms of using tools like Facebook and other social media to polarize communities further and divide them further on various issues like the Black racism or LGBTQ or Democrat, Republican, left, right, abortion, anti-abortion. So all of these things just to keep the divisions going, and the age-old British Empire axiom, divide and rule, but now having these modern tools to be able to do it with minimal expense. So instead of like standing armies, destroy societies from within by getting them to fight and war amongst themselves. So one key issue of weaponization of social media on a genocidal scale is Myanmar, where Facebook going into Myanmar, they're the ones subsidizing the internet for the country of Myanmar. Their website is the primary tool in which people see the world in Myanmar. And then all these conspiracy theories about Muslims started to be circulated on Facebook and demonized Muslims in Myanmar, the Rohingya, and it resulted in tens of thousands of people being killed, a million refugees. So, and then if we look at moderators or people that moderate content in the English language, most of their budgets are for the English language content, but other countries that may have, certain dialects that they won't even warrant that expense for moderating content, and it's left to go unchecked. And governments weaponize social media on a big scale, but also on a smaller scale to keep dividing people on many different levels in Western societies now.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
if you could talk about how, again, with mental health and how it's even just kind of leading into a sense of hopelessness for certain people in society, because there's almost like there's no centrist voice. It's one extreme or the other, and the vast majority don't ascribe to far right or far left. And yet all we're hearing is, because of these algorithms that are prioritizing extremely engageable content that people find sensational, that the actual moderate voices are drowned out.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that speaks to several of the studies on the influence of conspiracy theories. So what we find is that people, there are not many, strong influencers in terms of conspiracy theory. But the problem is that their effect is massive. So it doesn't take too many to actually reach out to a lot of people and have that strong impact on a lot of people. So I think that is as well an issue. Now, in terms of the Tarek, can you come back on the question? I just suddenly had a full.
And
I guess you're gonna
the weaponization
do
of
some cutting, right? This is not on. This is not direct or.
yeah, and we can cut this out, but the weaponization of social media and
Yeah.
how that weaponization is dividing societies on
Oh yeah, the Midvoices. Yeah, exactly. So I think what's happening is that, and this has been historically the case, the way that media outlets get their money, get their attention is from, right, the clicks, the likes, the uses, the transfers, and
engagement time.
And it has been, I mean, they have discovered a while ago that people will engage in things that are polarized, that are sensational. This is where our vulnerability lies in terms of engaging with information that is complex, nuanced, longer, explained in long, very, kind of nuanced text becomes boring for your user, especially in today's world where you have to consume quick information. And so there's something inherent to the way that information and to the way that economic and the information system is connected. And it is inherently problematic in my point of view, that makes those polarized messages more popular, easier, people have, easier to believe in because they require less, cognitive, mental, emotional effort to kind of understand. And so people relay that. And the big tech companies and the media companies have understood that. So they use that. And what it does, as you said, with the algorithm, with the echo chambers, etc., is that it silences the people in the middle, let's say, but also it makes them appear as silent because they attract less of the attention. The impact is less strong. And they are also given less, they will be less interviewed, they are given less voice and themselves speak out less because they tend to be in the middle, because they tend to be nuanced, because they don't have something extraordinarily sensationalist to say. And so they tend to take less time and be less attractive. And so we have to, as you said, we have, in media, the way that we relay information, we have to work on relaying less and less sensationalist information because we know that the impact is bigger, and give more and more space to this information that's situated in the middle and to individuals who have more moderate voices. But then you got to go convince the big news companies and the big tech and media companies to do that. And this has been a significant challenge.
And as you said, the profit motive, because they are corporations and they have a quote unquote fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to provide the maximum return on investment quarter by quarter, year by year. They have to keep increasing revenues and profits at the expense of society's mental well-being and society as a whole. As long as they get that engagement, the user base and everything keeps moving in an upward direction, the actual collateral damage of what happens to people's psyches and their relationships and the countries themselves are actually a minor priority, it seems, to these social media companies. And another argument is if they regulate themselves, another social media company from another country won't regulate, and then they're afraid of missing out. So it's almost like a catch-22. If we regulate ourselves, we stop it. Another company that doesn't do what we do, they can take their market share. So they become in this kind of locked arms race for viewers and for users.
Exactly. And then it becomes very complex, meaning how much resources are needed, what kind of resources, what kind of, so if you likely do know that you have individuals, humans that are moderating extreme content, right? And so how do you train those individuals? How do you take care of them? They are exposed to all sorts of horrific images that they have to take out, or discourses. what kind of resources are available, how much it will cost the companies, what kind of laws and regulations have been developed. So unfortunately, internet is behaving in ways that has escaped our control. And sometimes our capacities and sometimes even our understanding of how to regulate that content. Speaking also to the issue that in some countries you have regulations that will allow you to regulate, you have laws, and in other countries you don't. So this is why I think that there should be a global effort. It cannot just be a local effort of one tech company or one country. It really has to be a global effort around how do you regulate content that is clearly extremely harmful to individuals or to communities. For example, videos of attacks, some clear calls for violent actions or for genocide. This is content that obviously needs to be regulated. But the problem is that it's both, there's the issue of will, you're right, and there's the issue of understanding how and what tools to do it.
And you talked about nuance, and so the nuance as it relates to minorities, let's say people from the Muslim faith, and then the Black community, First Nations, Jewish community, LGBTQ, and other communities. So the nuance of what is offensive to certain communities is at times lost on these companies. So if the board of directors of many of these tech companies and their primary investors are white Caucasian, as an example. So if they're white Caucasian male, they have only one perspective on the way they view racism, and they view oppression, and they view discrimination, because they can only see it from their own lived experience. And without those diverse perspectives and views and nuance, they're not going to see how harmful and dangerous it is, because it doesn't affect them. And so that's another key aspect of a lot of these organizations. They are for-profit companies, but they are almost like utilities for information that used to be governed by governments in terms of libraries and university institutions, but now for-profit companies have a monopoly on how information is being ranked and presented, and as a result, we're in a situation where only a certain view of society is being represented, and the minority communities are, because of lack of will, as you said, lack of resources, whatever, or all of the above, the nuanced respect for other communities is not there in social media. And maybe we can talk about how the mental health issues in terms of minorities and people of color and religious minorities, because of all this, I think there's almost like much more mental health issues for minority communities, because we have to deal with multiple layers of discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, this is very true. And it all relates to what you said, the issues of privileges, right? And the fact that we see the world from within our privileges. So it becomes very difficult to understand the inherent bias unless we have a very diverse racialized communities and people from minorities. The trouble is that they face several experiences of discrimination and exclusion. Sometimes it's direct, and sometimes it's very subtle and indirect in the way that our institutions function. And they have to develop a lot of resiliency. And unfortunately, with the rise of white supremacy and with the rise of what we can call on the extreme violent right spectrum, there are very, let's say, tragic big events and attacks. But what's also less given attention is those daily aggressions that they're not illegal, they're not spectacularly tragic. They are those daily events, those daily hurtful words, those daily discriminatory acts that the communities have to face, and that they have to deal with the anxiety that it provokes, but also sometimes with the feeling of injustice and anger and also with the kind of, unfortunately, losing the trust. So what I always say is that what is essential for community and for society well-being generally is to be able to feel a sense of security and trust with the people who live around us. But when the people who live around you become a source of discrimination and exclusion, then this relationship of trust, this basic human need, the need for security, is threatened, which significantly affect mental health issues. And I think that prevention programs now, we need to mobilize. So we need to empower our communities to be able to develop resiliency in the face of hate, to be more present. So that's another issue as well, is that sometimes we kind of, push back and kind of close to protect ourselves and to protect our community. We have to make the effort to have our voices heard more, to be more present, to be more active. We need to be empowered to, from within, develop initiatives that help us build resiliency to hate and to discrimination, and not wait and not depend for the resources or the power or the opportunities to come from outside. We really have to start mobilizing from the inside, because this is the only way to have, to advance, because from the inside, it means people who know, people who have experienced, who have both like kind of experiential knowledge, but also that kind of, they can go get resources. So we can empower our youth, for example, to be able to develop resiliency to hate and kind of quote unquote counter discourses to the hateful discourses that they face on sometimes for some on, I wouldn't say daily basis, but very, very often. Your mic is muted, Todd.
Sorry about that. And the real world engagement is the key to get people to know one another, to get to know each other. And so part of what we've done in British Columbia is do something what we call the interfaith exchange, where we would visit churches and synagogues on their days of worship as friends and neighbors, and then be a source to answer any questions that people might have about Islam and Muslims. And on the flip side, invite people to our mosque for Jummah and for other programs, and break bread and get to know one another, because as you said, most people just stick within their communities. And by doing that on this local level, friendships and relationships are built. But one of the amazing things we learned from the Muslim context is that in many of the churches and synagogues that we visited, many people said they'd never met a Muslim before. So if they'd never met a Muslim before, the next question is, so what do you know about Islam and Muslims? And they would say, well, whatever we see online or from their community. And we had one pastor that said, when we came, what would Jesus forward in an email? Meaning a lot of conspiracy theories about Muslims, like somehow Muslims are trying to implement Sharia law in Canada, is a big conspiracy theory. The female genital mutilation is another conspiracy theory that they bandy about, terrorists and all that sort of thing. So by getting to know one another, visiting each other's place of worship and creating those friendships, it really brought down a lot of walls of ignorance. And one key thing that we've done on a systemic level is we've started school presentations with multiple groups. So from our First Nations leader, we had Jody Wilson-Raybould, the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, talking about the First Nations experience, myself, Yusuf, talking about the Muslim experience, Jewish rabbis talking about the Jewish experience, Asian leaders in law enforcement and others talking about being an Asian in Canada. And by having those multiple perspectives, because we kind of see things from a Muslim perspective, but to understand how do First Nations people feel, or how do Asian people feel, and how do Jewish people feel, and from that it really helps that community building. So from a mental health perspective, as we talked about in the beginning, is bringing people together and that sense of belonging, that sense of community, that sense of good neighbors, that is, it's hard work because it's one-on-one, it's group to group. But in your opinion, have you felt that these kind of real world interactions help on in one's mental health and also in this anti-racism work?
So they absolutely do. Intercultural, interfaith, interreligious, this mixing,
Yeah.
those prevention programs around mixing are very, very important because, as you said, it is only when we know people from different backgrounds that we can develop that kind of connection. And also it's very important because it helps us kind of de-essentialize. So what we tend to do is kind of put everybody, like the Muslims, and like all Muslims are the same, right? So we can tend to essentialize Jews or Muslims or, women, whatever category. So when we get in touch, when we interact, when we collaboratively also work on developing, for example, an art project with, youth from different faiths or different skin colors or communities, and we're working toward a common goal, then we develop bonds, and we cannot essentialize anymore because we discover, the individuality of each person, and then we can discover the diversity within each community. So we do definitely need to continue these because they help. But what we also need to do is to encourage the connections between, because, we can do that. But then the other side also is, how do you, attacks still happen and they will still happen. But then how do you do to reduce that so that one vulnerable individual who is on the, highly risk of committing an attack? So what do you do? So there are a lot of interventions that need to be done on the other side as well. And also connections between members. We should not, and we should try to work very hard not to have individuals who are isolated to the extent that there is no one around them to detect that there is something that's worrisome happening. It just does not make sense that we have individuals who can, spend hours and hours going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into something that is clearly going to lead them to a tragic consequence, and having just no one around to say, hey, something's not right, we need help, we have to do something. So the trouble is that there are people sometimes also around those vulnerable individuals or those individuals at risk that notice that there is something going wrong, but they don't know where to turn, or they're too afraid to ask for help. And so we also need to make those help sources accessible. And on another side, we also need to know how to tackle white supremacist or xenophobic or hateful groups, because we can build resiliency in our communities. But if we don't ever try to tackle those groups and see how we can, from the inside, operate changes, then we're making people more resilient to hate, but we're not necessarily reducing the actual hate that they are experiencing. So we really need to work on all of the sides at the same time. Those, very, very few individuals who may be at risk of committing a tragic incident. Extremist groups themselves, we have to try to find ways to make them less extremists or at least less prone to violent action, and then building general society's resilience as such. Like, you have layers, right? Depending on how entrenched into extremism individuals will be.
Absolutely, and it's a lot of work, and part of it is allyship and working together on multiple fronts. And with yourself in Quebec, ourselves in British Columbia, and we have multiple people that do similar work in the different provinces, and to work together with like-minded groups and individuals to affect societal change, because it does require top to bottom, bottom up approaches on
Yeah.
multiple levels, because we have. Kind of a situation now where in Canada in the last 5 years, 11 Muslims have been killed by white supremacist extremists. And we've had countless Muslim women that have been attacked because of their appearance in terms of in Edmonton and Vancouver and other Calgary, just for being Muslim, rocks thrown at them and what have you. So it is something that we just heard about a mosque that was burnt down by a white supremacist in Alberta. This happened 2 years ago, and I didn't even see it in the news. So even our own things that happen to our Muslim community are under reported in the news media. And so by
Yeah.
working together to kind of really highlight, at least because we have our lived experience as Muslims, to highlight the needs of our community and to protect our community, I think part of the next steps after this conversation, we can talk about how we can all work together across Canada with all the other faith communities and racial minorities, and with the general public to kind of really address it on a societal and a systemic level. And we really appreciate you taking your time to kind of share your expertise and your background, which is significant because it is a multi-layered approach. And the key takeaway for mental health and self-care, are there any recommendations for people to take care of themselves, their mental health and emotional health in these unprecedented times, as a takeaway for this?
So I think the first one is to go back on belonging. We should not keep ourselves isolated in these situations. We need to seek help, and we need to seek the presence and the being able to confide in people who have always been significant. People in our lives, to go back to connect with community, that is with the communities, with the real world, real people, flesh and bone communities. I think one important message is also we need to educate and inform parents on their role to help their children to understand internet and social media, and to understand their behaviors on internet and social media, as well as parents' behaviors in social media themselves. We need another way is to avoid being overexposed. So, you don't need to look and look and look again for that hateful message and relay, look what happened to that person. And it's important to inform, but also to protect ourselves from being overexposed to things that can become traumatic for ourselves. So that's very important. But I think that also, supporting parents and educating parents and families and their youth and young children about the place and the space that internet and social media must and must not take in our lives is really very important. And just generally, we need to try to continue on doing the things that do us good, whether it is sitting with friends, praying, taking a walk, taking care, doing exercise, those very simple things. Sometimes it's funny, people tell me, it's just that. Well, yes, it is just those general protective factors that do us good, that help us take care of our psychological and mental health in situations where we may be feeling a little bit more vulnerable. And never be ashamed and never be hesitant to seek help. Because, it's not about pride or reputation. We all go through difficult phases in our lives. We have to not hesitate to tell somebody, I'm not at my best right now. I need support or I need help. It's very important.
Agreed. And Ghayda, we really appreciate you joining us, your valuable time to share your insight and your knowledge and background. Thank you again. And that's the end of the podcast. Thank you very much.